Yes, we'll be happy to take your love to Portage La Prairie. We'll be glad to do that for you. So I'd like to invite you, brothers and sisters, to take your Bibles, turn to Hebrews 13 and verse 6. Notice there what Paul urges us to do. Hebrews 13 and verse 6. He says there, so that we may be of good courage and say, Jehovah is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? You notice what Paul urges you to be there? What kind of persons? Persons of good courage. Courage means to be strong, bold, valiant. It comes from the Hebrew word shazak. Well, maybe it's not always easy to be persons of good courage, but what's the key there so that despite the fact we may struggle at times, we can be? He says, let Jehovah be your helper. You see, that's the key. It's true, sometimes we may feel quite the opposite, and on occasions like that, maybe the Hebrew word rapha better describes our feelings. That Hebrew word means to lose courage, to show oneself discouraged. It's a terrible feeling, isn't it, when you get discouraged? We don't like that feeling one bit whatsoever. In Proverbs 24 and verse 10, it well describes there what it's like when we become discouraged. It says, our power is scanty. What an apt description that is of discouragement. Yes, when we get like that, it seems like we just don't have the heart for things. Our hands kind of hang down at our sides, and we just feel it's not worth going on. It's not worth trying to hang on to the truth. Sometimes it's circumstances over which we have little or no control that may discourage us. You see, sometimes as we get older, it brings struggles along with it, or sometimes we struggle with physical sickness or depression. Sometimes we may lose a loved one in death. That's discouraging. Sometimes there's a situation that comes about in the family that can be kind of discouraging for us. Sometimes, though, we can actually discourage ourselves by the kind of attitude or thinking that we allow to develop in ourselves. Now we might say, but why should we get discouraged? I mean, we're Jehovah's people. We worship the true God. He's a happy God. He's given us the kingdom hope. We know He's going to carry out that promise. We're part of a beautiful brotherhood. Why should I get discouraged? Well, my brothers and sisters, just because we're a worshiper of Jehovah, that's not a guarantee that we will never get discouraged. No. Worshippers of Jehovah in times past became discouraged at times, so it will happen to us. Maybe discouragement seems worse today, and because of the kind of times we're living in, difficult and hard to deal with. And of course, Satan likes to see us get discouraged, because then he knows that we can lose our joy in serving Jehovah. But what we're going to do in this talk is just look at some examples of faithful worshipers of times past, and what caused them to become discouraged, and how they coped with that. We'll learn from those things as we look at these examples. So the first example we'll look at here is found in the book of Luke 24. Luke 24, starting in verse 13. Now the time period that we're looking in on here is not too long after Jesus' death and resurrection. So here in chapter 24, and starting in verse 13, we find two of the disciples walking along from Jerusalem to a nearby village. So in verse 14, notice it says, and they were conversing with each other over all these things that had come about. Can you imagine how that conversation must have been going? They were probably saying to each other, what a terrible thing this is that happened to Jesus. Why did something like that have to happen? He was an innocent man, and they killed him. We expected so much of this man. Well, it goes on to say in verse 15, now as they were conversing and discussing, Jesus himself approached and began walking with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. That's because the body he'd materialized here was different than what they were used to seeing him in. So he says to them in verse 17, what are these matters that you yourselves are debating as you walk along? And they stood still with sad faces, and then in answer one of them said, where have you been, man? that you don't know what's happened here in Jerusalem. But do you notice what it said there about them at the end of verse 17? It says they stood still with sad faces. So what does that tell us about them? They were discouraged. They were discouraged. What brought that discouragement? Well, something that they weren't really expecting. Oh, Jesus had been telling them that he was going to be killed, but they didn't want to believe that. No. And now here it suddenly happens, and they were expecting so much from this one. They loved his teaching, and now he was gone. It was like the wind had been taken out of them. It's like they'd been brought to their knees. They were discouraged. So, brothers and sisters, sometimes that happens to us today too. You know, life may be going along, not too bad, and then suddenly something can happen that we weren't really expecting. And sometimes it just feels like it's kicked the feet right out from under us. We feel like we've fallen flat on our face. We feel winded. And yes, like these faithful disciples here, we can start feeling discouraged, sad-faced. Sometimes it may be a situation that we've been struggling with, trying to make it better, but it just doesn't seem to get any better. It's discouraging. Well, with the disciples here, did things turn around for them from being sad-faced? Yes. As you read on in the account, you find that Jesus walks along with them and he says, look, you really shouldn't be sad-faced. You shouldn't be discouraged. And then he explains in the fullest detail how everything that's happened with the Messiah fulfilled Hebrew prophecy to the letter. Well, they just love what he's telling them. So now they finally reach the village, and they say to him, say, why don't you stay and have a bite to eat with us? And he agrees. Now let's pick up the account here in verse 30. And as he was reclining with them at the meal, he took the loaf, blessed it, broke it, and began to hand it to them. At that, their eyes were fully opened, and they recognized him. And he disappeared from them. So apparently in the way that Jesus said the blessing there and broke the bread, they recognized something familiar here. They realized, oh, Jesus isn't dead any longer. He's been resurrected. Wow! How exciting this was to them. Thrilling. And then notice what it says in verse 32. And they said to each other, were not our hearts burning as he was speaking to us on the road and as he was fully opening up the scriptures to us? What a change of feeling. One from being sad-faced and discouraged to now being persons of courage again and having joy. But why did it turn around like this for them? Well, it's because, brothers and sisters, even though they got discouraged there, felt kind of sad-faced. You see, the important thing is, they did not give up on the truth. You see, they knew that what Jesus taught them was the truth. They knew he was the Messiah. And so they clung to that, despite being discouraged. And because they did, you see how Jehovah in time proved to be their helper. And they got some of their courage back and some of their joy back. So my brothers and sisters, do you think there's a lesson we can learn from this? Well, of course. See, there will be times today when we do get discouraged. We'll get sad-faced. We'll feel winded, weary. But my brothers and sisters, when we start to feel like that, please, that's not the time to start backing away from the truth and saying, what's the point? No. It's the time to try all the harder to cling to the truth. Cling to Jehovah. You see, that's the only way, my brothers and sisters, to maintain your courage and joy, or if your courage and joy has got to weigh on you a little bit, the only way to recover it is to stick with Jehovah, the truth, and the precious brotherhood. Good lesson in this account. Let's look at another example of a faithful worshiper who became discouraged. Let's go to Psalm 73, verse 21. We're going to be reading here about Asaph. Very honest about what happens here with him and explaining the matter. So he tells us this in Psalm 73 and verse 2, And verse 21, he says, as for me, my feet had almost turned aside. My steps had nearly been made to slip. And then verse 21, he says, for my heart was soured, and in my kidneys I was sharply pained. Oh my. Now here's a man who's really discouraged. He's totally discouraged. He's down there in a black hole, isn't he? Life just looks gray to him. But how did this happen to this man, this faithful worshiper? How did he get discouraged to this point? Well, he's very honest and he tells us. See, let's read here now in verse 3, 7 and 13. He says in verse 3, I became envious of the boasters when I would see the very peace of wicked people. And then verse 7, their eye has bulged from fatness. They have exceeded the imaginations of the heart. And verse 13, surely it is in vain that I have cleansed my heart and that I wash my hands in innocence itself. Interesting. Can you discern there what it was that caused Asaph's discouragement? It was because of the kind of thinking or attitude that he allowed to develop in himself. You see, he started to look out at people of the world, people who weren't worshiping Jehovah. And it seemed to him, well, look at all the stuff they have. Look how much better off they are. Look at what they're getting away with. And then he said, where is it better to be a worshiper of Jehovah? Why am I doing it? What's the point? What am I gaining myself? And so he got to the point where he was kind of sour. He got kind of sour even about his lot in life as a worshiper of Jehovah God. Do you think something like that could ever happen to us today? Oh yes, my brothers and sisters. It can happen. And to any one of us. We too sometimes, we could maybe look out at the world and say to ourselves, oh man, don't people in the world have it good? If only I wasn't one of Jehovah's Witnesses. Think of all the time I'd have to do those things. But no, here I am, one of Jehovah's people. Got to do this, got to do that. Or as young people, you can feel that way too. You look out at young people that go to school, and it seems to you, look at all the things they get away with. Man, do they ever have an exciting life? And here I am, I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses, all hemmed in by all these rules and everything. Who wants to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses? Well, you see, of course, brothers and sisters, when we start feeling that way about the truth, yes, we'll discourage ourselves. We'll become, yes, even sour about our lot in life as one of Jehovah's people. And that's a sad situation. With Asaph here, did it turn around for him? Yes, and a good thing. He tells us how. Notice here in verse 27 and 28, he says, look, the very ones keeping away from you will perish. You will certainly silence everyone immorally leaving you. But as for me, the drawing near to God is good for me. In the sovereign Lord Jehovah, I have placed my refuge to declare all your works. Quite a change here now, isn't there? But what brought this change about for Asaph? Well, he made a little attitude adjustment, didn't he? He got a proper perspective on things again and came to his senses and realized, well, the people of the world really, what did they really have? Did they have Jehovah's favor and blessing? Well, of course not. They may have had stuff and things. But whereas with himself as a worshiper of Jehovah and others who worship Jehovah, well, he says, it is good to be with my God Jehovah and to experience his approval. Got the proper perspective again. So brothers and sisters, you think there's a lesson we can learn out of this? Well, of course. Please, my brothers and sisters, work hard to keep the proper perspective of things. Really, ask yourself, come on, what does the world really have to offer you? Really? Really? Stuff and things, that's all. And in the end, nothing. Whereas look what Jehovah is offering you. A spiritual paradise to be part of right now. A possession of having a relationship with him. The precious hope of the kingdom. To be part of a beautiful brotherhood. So work hard to keep the proper perspective. Over my years of being in the truth, I've learned something, and I'm sure you brothers and sisters have learned the same thing, and it's this. It's not the truth that makes the problems for us. It's not the truth. When you think about that, you have to realize that. Think about, for example, when you went to the special assembly day earlier on in the fall there. Or maybe some of you have worked on a quick build, or like you're soon going to do in the renovation here. Do you remember how you felt when you were there? It was wonderful, wasn't it? You just wished you never had to go home. It was so good to be there. If only I could stay here all the time. So what is that telling you about the truth? Well, it's not the truth that makes the problems for you, but rather it's the things that we have to take on from outside as we try to make a living for ourselves, provide for our families. It's those outside things that puts the pressures on us. And our own organism, which is not perfect, we're imperfect, so we suffer from physical problems, aging, we suffer from depression, and those things bring struggles on us. Sometimes we bring the struggles on ourselves of our own volition. You know, the world has so much stuff they'd like to have us have, and so many things to do, and sometimes you'd like to have and do some of that stuff. So you start. And then maybe before you know it, you've got a big debt that you're trying to take care of, and then you have to start working like crazy, and you're just going around in circles. You got your wife working, your kids, and then you start saying to yourself, you know, if I wasn't in the truth, I wouldn't be so busy. If I just wasn't in the truth. No, don't blame it on the truth. So you see, my brothers and sisters, like I say, work hard to keep your proper perspective of the truth. And thus you will be able to, even though you may struggle at times, you will be able to keep your courage and your joy in serving Jehovah. Sometimes you may think to yourself, if only we weren't so busy as Jehovah's Witnesses. We weren't so busy. But brothers and sisters, what time is it? Now don't tell me it's almost time to go home. Rather, the time it is the time of the end. And we're deep down into the time of the end, with difficult days hard to deal with. So it's understandable that we'd have to be busy in caring for our spiritual needs, or else how are we going to make our way through these difficult last days? Sometimes we may feel, if it only wasn't so much always of the same old thing, you know. Study for the watchtower. Go to the Kingdom Hall. Go out in the field service. Read my Bible. Prepare for the meetings. Go to the Kingdom Hall. Go out in the field service. And, so much of the same old thing. It gets just tiring. Well, my brothers and sisters, again, should we become discouraged because it requires of us that we be busy, and sometimes, yes, it involves doing the same things again and again. Can't we look past that and see the end result? Why get discouraged over that? Let's learn a lesson here from an account in Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6. And the time period we're going to be looking in on here, verse 3 and 4, time period we're looking in on here is when the Israelites were finally going to go into the promised land, finally capture their first city, bring it to its ruin, Jericho, and Jehovah tells them exactly how to do it. So he says in verse 3, and all you men of war must march around the city, going around the city once. That is the way you should do for 6 days. Just one verse, but I'll tell you it's a lot in that verse there. This is no small accomplishment that Jehovah is asking him to do here. He says, all you men of war. Can you imagine the thousands and thousands of men this would have involved? Think of all the organizing. Think how early they would have had to get up in the morning to get themselves organized and then to march around that big city of Jericho. And likely by then it would be the heat of the day. Talk about hot. And then those thousands of feet pounding the earth, the dust going up. Hard work. Busy. And to think they had to do that same old thing for 6 days in a row. Talk about repetitive. But what about the seventh day? Let's look here in verse 4. And 7 priests should carry 7 ram's horns, before the ark, and on the seventh day you should march around the city. Oh no, 7 times. 7 times as much of the same old thing. But it's interesting here, really, isn't it, when you think about it? You see, as they were getting down to the end of that climactic period of time, isn't it interesting to see how Jehovah had them pick up their activity? They became more busy there. But what was the end result? That's the key. Let's look here in verse 20. It says, this was after they had blown the horns. It says, then the people shouted when they proceeded to blow the horns, and it came about that as soon as the people heard the sound of the horn, and the people began to shout a great war cry, then the wall began to fall down flat. And after that the people went up into the city, each one straight before him, and captured the city. Wow. Can you just imagine how they must have been filled with courage as they saw how Jehovah was proving to be their helper? What joy they must have experienced as they saw this blessing that Jehovah was giving him. And you know, after all the dust was settled and everything was finished there, they must have looked back on the first 6 days, and then that 7th day of walking around 7 times, they probably looked back and said, that was nothing. It was really nothing. See, in comparison to what Jehovah had done for them here, proved to be their helper and bringing them joy. So brothers and sisters, do you think we can learn something like from this account? Well, of course. Can we not find some joy in our busy life as a servant of Jehovah God? Can't we see past our busyness? Yes, maybe some of it is repetitive. Can't we see past that? And the end result it is going to bring? That end result being, even as we're doing right now, vindicating Jehovah's sovereignty, keeping his name holy, yes, and saving ourselves and those that listen to us. So, same way with us, when all the dust is settled after Armageddon, we'll look back and we'll say, boy, am I ever glad I kept myself busy before this all happened. Why? We'll say to ourselves, that was nothing. It was just nothing. So glad to do that. Do you suppose there were some back there that maybe grumbled and complained a little bit? There might have been. There might have been some who said, I'm not getting up early tomorrow morning. Forget that. I'm going to sit in my tent all day. Well, if they did that, they lost out on the joy of Jehovah, didn't they? Wouldn't have had the courage for Jehovah's work like they should have had. So that's something else to think about, brothers and sisters. How it is important that we try to, even though we may have some terrible struggles at times, but that we try to stay happy with the truth, with our relationship with Jehovah, and the work he's given us to do. Because if we don't, you can lose your courage. Let's learn a lesson about this from an account in Numbers 13 and verse 32. Numbers 13, verse 32. And here it says, and this is going back to that period of time there when Jehovah had asked them to send out 12 spies into the land and spy it out. So recall that they came back. 2 of them told a very positive story. And they said, look, Jehovah's with us. Let's go up and take that territory he's assigned us. But the other 10, they had a horror story to tell. So they say, verse 32, and they kept on bringing forth to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land which we passed through to spy it out is a land that eats up its inhabitants. And then they went on and on to say, you should see their cities. Man, they're fortified to the teeth. You should see how the men are armed. And besides that, they're like giants. We're just grasshoppers. We're doomed. What chance do we have? We should have just stayed back there in Egypt. Well, you see, as they now develop this negative spirit, this unhappiness with Jehovah's territory assignment and the work he wanted them to do, look how it affected them. They lost their courage, their joy in doing Jehovah's work. Shot themselves in the foot, didn't they? Maybe in the head too. Sad results. But how, as they talked about it this way, unhappily, in a sour way, how did it affect others? Well, let's look here in chapter 14 and verse 1 and 2. It says, "Then all of the assembly raised their voice, and the people continued giving vent to their voice and weeping all through the night. And all the sons of Israel began to murmur against Moses and Aaron. And all of the assembly began to say, 'Oh, if only we died off in the land of Egypt.'" So now you see how the whole camp there, the whole congregation, is infected with a spirit of unhappiness with Jehovah, with Moses and Aaron, with the territory Jehovah wanted to give them. And because they became so unhappy, they lost their courage and the joy that Jehovah wanted them to have. So, my brothers and sisters, we can learn from that account, don't we? Can't we? Yes, it's very true. We do sometimes have struggles, sometimes very difficult ones. But through all that, can we work to stay happy with Jehovah, with the truth, with our brothers and sisters? As we work hard to do that, even though we may struggle at times, we will be people of courage and joy. Now you might say, but Brother Fuessel, you don't understand. You just don't understand how I feel. You don't know how I just feel in a black hole. I'm down in a pit of despair. Life is just black and ugly. And yes, brothers and sisters, sometimes we do get feeling that way. Maybe by some struggle that's come along in life, some physical sickness hard to deal with, depression, family struggles, unemployment, various things. And so sometimes we may feel like that inside. But rather than thinking to ourselves, if we even start thinking, well, what's the point? Might as well just give up on the truth. I don't care anymore. But if we get to that point where we start feeling like that, my brothers and sisters, don't try to deal with it yourself. Besides leaning on Jehovah, maybe we should also be talking to someone else about it, telling them how you feel. Let them listen to you. Maybe say a word of prayer for you. And you may say to yourself, no one really knows how I feel or what I'm going through. And it's true, sometimes our fellow man doesn't even know what's happening to us or can completely understand. But there is someone that does. Let's look here at a very encouraging account. Actually, it was in our day's text the other day. This scripture here in Exodus 3 and verse 7. I found this very encouraging. So the Israelites may have been feeling to themselves, well, who really knows that kind of bitter despair we're in here? But what does Jehovah tell Moses? Exodus 3 and verse 7. "Unquestionably, I have seen the affliction of my people, and I have heard their outcry." And then he says a little further on, "I well know the pains that they suffer." Isn't that beautiful? So you see, Jehovah is looking at you as an individual and is aware of the pain of heart that you may be dealing with. And he says, I care. And I know how you feel. And Jehovah, who is a God of comfort, wants to help us to deal with those feelings. But brothers and sisters, that's the way Jehovah is, and we can imitate Jehovah by being discerning. Sometimes at the Kingdom Hall, you may notice that for a period of time, someone is looking kind of down. They're not their usual selves, look a bit discouraged. Well, can we not be persons of initiative and go to that person and say a few words of encouragement? Listen to them as they maybe pour out their heart. Maybe say or share with them a nice, encouraging scripture, or how about a beautiful word of prayer? And thus we can help each other out in maintaining our courage and our joy in serving Jehovah. You see, Jehovah wants us to have joy as we serve him. He doesn't ask us to do things that are designed to rob us of our joy. What kind of a God would that be? Rather, in Psalm 100 and verse 2, it says, "Serve Jehovah with rejoicing. Come in before him with a joyful cry." But how is that possible when we're struggling with something? Well, what does it go back to? Hebrews 13 and verse 6. See, it said, you can be of good courage if you do what? Let Jehovah be your helper. And remember how to do that. Always, my brothers and sisters, always keep firmly attached to Jehovah, his precious truth, and the organization. You see, here with Jehovah is the place to maintain your courage and joy, or if it's gotten away on you a little bit, to have it renewed and recover some of your courage and joy, even though you have struggles. As well, brothers and sisters, keep yourself busy with the truth according to your circumstances. Sometimes we may think, well, I'm going to do less. I really think I'd be happier if I just did less in the truth. Forget that. It doesn't work that way. It's when you keep yourself busy according to your circumstances with the truth that you stay a person of more courage and joy. And remember, too, keep the proper perspective. It's not the truth that makes the problems for us. Rather, the things on the outside we have to take on and our own human imperfections. And finally, my brothers and sisters, try to find some gladness. Just try to stay happy with your busy life as one of Jehovah's people. And even though you have struggles, my brothers and sisters, at times, you will be able to do these things. Keep your joy, keep your courage through all of your struggles. If you do what? What did Paul say? Make Jehovah your helper. So may Jehovah richly bless you, brothers and sisters, as you keep on doing that. Well, we want to thank you very much for a wonderful week with you, dear brothers and sisters. So Friday night we talked about two important things that in the months ahead, please give your heart to, because it'll help you to be persons of courage and joy. What were those two things? They were mentioned at the Watchtower study today. All right, Sister Winez, just go ahead and...
Reading the Bible every day and regular meeting attendance.
Good. You've just got that imprinted right there, haven't you? Now turn that imprint into action. Jehovah will bless you for that. So we want to thank you very much for your support for field service. 32 out this morning for Sunday field service, and we had such a good time. So as you give your heart to stirring up your territory and trying to start Bible studies, Jehovah will make things grow. We thank you very much for your hospitality. It's beautiful. And your words of encouragement. And we love you, brothers and sisters, very much for those things. Now let's bring the meeting to a close with song number 16. And it's titled, ties right in with what we've been talking about. Number 16, Be Joyful for the Kingdom Hope. So think about those words as you sing it, and it'll make you feel joyful. Number 16.